Your family will never be worthy of carrying the Wilson name. Benjamin Wilson didn't whisper those words. He made sure everyone in the room heard them, especially my son. Then he stood, adjusted his tailored suit, smiled as if he had just settled an ordinary business meeting, and walked away. Less than 12 hours later, my 34-year-old son was sitting on a wooden bench in Alms Park with two duffel bags at his feet, while my 5-year-old grandson happily drank a box of grape juice without realizing he no longer had a home. That phone call changed everything. My name is Cole Edwards. I'm 64 years old, and until that morning, my son believed I was nothing more than a retired mechanic who spent his days restoring old cars. At 9:43 a.m., my phone rang. Nolan's name appeared on the screen. I answered with a smile that disappeared before I finished saying hello. Dad. His voice was barely audible. Can you come get us? I didn't ask questions. 15 minutes later, I pulled into Alms Park. Nolan was staring across the Ohio River, his shoulders slumped as though every ounce of hope had been drained from him overnight. Beside him sat little Eli, quietly swinging his legs while holding the same baseball cap I had given him for Christmas. Children have a remarkable gift. They can smile even when the adults around them are falling apart. I sat beside my son without saying a word. After nearly a minute of silence, he finally spoke. It's over. I looked at the two duffel bags before looking back at him. Tell me. He rubbed both hands across his face. Benjamin had me fired this morning. He called the regional director himself. He paused, struggling to breathe evenly. Then Amelia filed for divorce. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice steady. Why now? Nolan let out a bitter laugh. Her father told her she had one choice: stay married to me and lose everything he built, or leave me and keep the family fortune. He lowered his eyes before whispering the sentence that hurt more than losing his marriage or his career. He said people like us don't belong in families like theirs. He said our bloodline would only embarrass the Wilson name. Before I could answer, Eli held up his juice box with a proud smile. Grandpa, it's my favorite flavor. I smiled back and gently ruffled his hair, but inside something had already changed. Benjamin Wilson thought he had humiliated one man. He had humiliated 3 generations of my family. I picked up one of the duffel bags and walked toward my truck. Nolan frowned. Dad, where are we going? I opened the passenger door and looked him straight in the eyes. For 32 years, I've hidden one part of my life because I wanted you to build your future without depending on my past. He stared at me in complete confusion. Today, you're finally going to see who your father really is. As the truck pulled away from the park, I wasn't taking my son home. I was taking him to the secret that would change both our lives before the week was over. Actual characters. To 2,470. My son didn't speak during the entire drive. He kept staring through the passenger window, while Eli quietly hummed to himself in the back seat, completely unaware that his parents' marriage had ended only hours earlier. After nearly 40 minutes, Nolan finally frowned as I turned away from the highway and drove through the security gates of an industrial complex that stretched across dozens of acres. 3 enormous buildings stood beyond the entrance, each carrying the same silver logo that read Nova Group. Hundreds of employees were walking between offices, while dozens of trucks rolled in and out of the loading yards. Nolan looked at me in confusion. Dad, why are we here? I parked beside the executive building but didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reached into the center console and pulled out an old leather wallet. Hidden behind my driver's license was a worn employee identification card that I hadn't shown anyone in years. I handed it to him. Nolan glanced at the photo, then froze. His eyes moved from the card to the name printed beneath it, then back to me. Chairman? He whispered. This has to be a joke. I smiled for the first time that morning. I founded Nova Group 32 years ago with 1 rented warehouse, 2 borrowed machines, and a loan your grandfather guaranteed with everything he owned. Nolan stared at the headquarters through the windshield as though seeing it for the first time. You own all of this? I nodded. Most people assume wealth has to be displayed. I spent my life proving the opposite. He looked completely speechless. Then why did you let me struggle? Why did you let me work ordinary jobs when you could have given me everything? I turned toward him before answering. Because I wanted you to become a man who could stand on his own feet before you ever stood on mine. Money can build comfort, but it can't build character. Nolan lowered his head, remembering every overtime shift, every promotion he had earned without favors, and every lesson I had refused to make easier for him. Benjamin thought he was judging a mechanic. I continued calmly. He never realized he was judging the man whose company supplies nearly 40% of his own business. Nolan's head snapped toward me. Weston Flow buys from Nova? For the last 11 years, I replied. They're one of our largest commercial clients. Before Nolan could ask another question, the front doors opened, and an elderly gentleman in a tailored navy suit walked briskly toward the truck. The moment he reached my window, he smiled warmly before opening the door himself. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," he said respectfully. "The board has been waiting for you." Nolan looked at me, then at the executive standing beside the truck, and finally back at the towering headquarters in front of us. Everything he believed about his father had just collapsed in a single morning. What he still didn't know was that I hadn't brought him there to show him my success. I had brought him there because, before this day ended, I intended to hand him the first piece of a legacy Benjamin Wilson never imagined existed. After we stepped inside, every conversation in the lobby came to an immediate stop. Employees smiled, nodded respectfully, and greeted me by name as though this happened every morning. Nolan walked beside me in complete silence, trying to reconcile the father who spent weekends changing his own engine oil with the man everyone inside this building clearly respected. We entered the executive elevator, and only after the doors closed did he finally find his voice. "You really never told me." I smiled faintly. "I never lied to you either. You simply never asked what I did before I retired." When the elevator reached the top floor, the board of directors was already waiting inside the conference room. Every person stood as we entered. The chairman of operations extended his hand toward Nolan. "We've been looking forward to meeting you, Mr. Edwards." Nolan instinctively looked at me, unsure whether he belonged in that room. I placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You belong here because of the man you've become, not because you're my son." After everyone took their seats, I walked to the head of the table and placed a thin blue folder in front of Nolan. Inside was a single document bearing the Nova Group seal. His eyes widened as he read the title, Director of Vendor Relations. He looked up immediately. "Dad, I can't accept this. People will think I only got the job because I'm your son." Several board members exchanged quiet smiles, but I shook my head. "If I wanted to hand you power, I could have done that years ago. I'm handing you responsibility." I opened another folder and slid several performance reports across the table. "During the last 8 years, you've negotiated supply contracts worth more than $200 million for Weston Flow. Every promotion you earned came from measurable results, not family connections. Your experience qualifies you for this position long before your last name does." Nolan slowly looked through the reports, recognizing many projects he had personally managed. He had built his career one achievement at a time without ever realizing he had been preparing for this moment. I continued, "This department oversees every supplier that wants to do business with Nova Group, including Weston Flow." The room became completely silent. Nolan slowly raised his eyes from the documents. "Benjamin's company reports to this department?" "Beginning today," I answered calmly. "They report to you." He leaned back in his chair, still struggling to process everything that had happened in less than 2 hours. "So, what do you want me to do?" I looked around the room before giving the same answer I had always expected from every executive in this company. "Nothing personal, nothing emotional. We don't punish people because they insult us. We evaluate them by one standard only: performance." I pressed a button on the conference table, and the procurement director immediately placed another file in front of Nolan. Across the cover, stamped in bold red letters, were 4 words that made him stare in disbelief: Vendor Performance Review, Weston Flow. At that exact moment, Benjamin Wilson had no idea that the routine business review already scheduled for the following morning was about to become the most important meeting of his entire career. Nolan didn't touch the Weston Flow file immediately. Instead, he stared through the conference room window, overlooking the manufacturing campus below. Hundreds of employees were beginning another ordinary workday, completely unaware that his own life had changed forever. Finally, he turned back toward me. "Dad, If Benjamin walks into this building tomorrow and sees me sitting on the other side of the table, he'll think this is revenge. I folded my hands together before answering. Then make sure he leaves knowing it wasn't. Several board members nodded quietly. That simple sentence captured the principle Nova Group had followed since the day I founded it. We never used power to settle personal scores. We used it to protect standards. I pushed the performance file toward Nolan. Open it. He slowly flipped through the reports. Delivery delays, quality complaints, missed compliance deadlines, escalating customer claims. None of the problems had anything to do with our family. They had existed for almost 18 months, hidden beneath impressive sales numbers and polished executive presentations. Nolan looked genuinely surprised. Why wasn't this addressed sooner? The procurement director answered before I could. Mr. Wilson's reputation carried a lot of weight in the industry. Every time concerns were raised, people assumed his company would eventually fix them. Nolan continued reading until he reached the final page. A recommendation had already been drafted weeks earlier, long before the confrontation at Weston Flow. It called for a complete vendor review based solely on declining performance metrics. He slowly closed the folder and looked at me. This was already scheduled before Benjamin fired me. I nodded. Yesterday's humiliation didn't create this meeting. It only changed who would be leading it. For the first time that morning, I saw the anger slowly leave my son's face. He finally understood that justice built on facts is always stronger than revenge built on emotion. What if he apologizes? Nolan asked quietly. I smiled. Then accept the apology with grace and continue reviewing the evidence. What if he insults me again? Then let him embarrass himself while you remain professional. I leaned forward slightly. Leadership isn't measured by how you treat people who respect you. It's measured by how calmly you treat people who don't. The room fell silent as Nolan absorbed every word. He had come to Nova Group believing I was about to rescue him. Instead, I was asking him to become the kind of leader who never needed rescuing again. Before the meeting ended, I handed him a simple navy blue employee badge bearing his new title. No gold lettering, no special privileges. Just another identification card like every executive in the building carried. He clipped it onto his jacket without saying a word. As we stood to leave, my executive assistant entered the room carrying a tablet. Mr. Edwards, she said, Weston Flow has confirmed tomorrow's vendor review. Mr. Benjamin Wilson personally requested to attend. I glanced toward Nolan. He calmly adjusted his new badge, picked up the performance file, and quietly replied, Good. Then tomorrow he'll finally be judged by the same standards he's always used to judge everyone else. None of us realized that Benjamin wasn't coming to defend a contract. He was coming with a plan that would reveal just how badly he had underestimated the Edwards family. Benjamin Wilson arrived exactly 10 minutes early the following morning, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit and carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had spent decades believing every room belonged to him. As he stepped through Nova Group's front entrance, he barely acknowledged the receptionist before handing over his business card. Benjamin Wilson, Weston Flow, I have a vendor review with your procurement department. The receptionist smiled politely and asked him to take a seat while she notified the executive floor. Benjamin glanced around the lobby with obvious admiration. He had done business with Nova Group for more than a decade, yet this was his first invitation inside the headquarters. He assumed today's meeting would be another routine discussion where his reputation would outweigh a few disappointing performance reports. Upstairs, Nolan quietly reviewed the final file one last time. Every number had been verified. Every complaint had supporting documentation. Every recommendation had already been approved through the proper channels before his appointment. There wasn't a single page influenced by personal emotion. I walked into his office carrying 2 cups of coffee and placed one beside him. Nervous? He smiled honestly. A little. I nodded. Good. The day you stop feeling responsible for your decisions is the day you stop being qualified to make them. Nolan looked down at the folder. Yesterday I wanted him to suffer. He paused before taking a slow breath. Today I just want to do my job. I couldn't have been prouder if he had announced he'd won the lottery. Anger had finally given way to judgment, and that was exactly what I had hoped to see. A few minutes later, my assistant entered the office. Mr. Edwards, Mr. Wilson has arrived. Nolan stood, straightened his jacket, and picked up the performance file. His movements were calm now, almost effortless. Before he reached the door, I called his name one last time. He turned toward me. Remember something. He waited quietly. Benjamin expects to meet the man he humiliated yesterday. Don't give him that man. Nolan smiled faintly. Who should I give him instead? I held his gaze for a moment before answering. The executive who protects this company. He nodded once and walked out. Downstairs, Benjamin continued checking his watch, growing slightly impatient. When the elevator doors finally opened, he immediately recognized Nolan walking across the lobby. For a brief second, surprise flashed across his face before it disappeared beneath a confident smile. He actually laughed under his breath, convinced my son had somehow talked his way into another temporary position after losing everything the day before. Nolan, he called as though greeting an old employee. I'm glad to see you're back on your feet so quickly. Nolan stopped a few feet away but didn't offer his hand. Good morning, Mr. Wilson. Benjamin adjusted his cufflinks and smiled again. I assume you're here to escort me upstairs. Nolan calmly met his eyes and replied, Actually, I'm here because today's review will be conducted under my authority. For the first time in many years, Benjamin Wilson's smile disappeared completely. Benjamin stood motionless for several seconds, studying Nolan's face as though he expected someone to step out and explain that everything was an elaborate joke. When nobody spoke, he forced out a short laugh. Very funny. Now, where's the procurement director? Nolan remained perfectly calm. The procurement director reports to me. Benjamin's smile faded. You're serious. Completely. Without another word, Nolan turned toward the executive elevator. After a brief hesitation, Benjamin followed. The confidence he had carried into the building was still there, but it was no longer effortless. For the first time that morning, uncertainty had found its way into his expression. When they entered the conference room, every member of the review committee was already seated. Performance analysts, compliance officers, legal advisors, and senior procurement executives all had identical copies of the evaluation report in front of them. No one looked surprised to see Nolan sitting at the head of the table. That detail alone told Benjamin everything he needed to know. This wasn't a last-minute decision. Nolan belonged there. Good morning, Mr. Wilson. Nolan began professionally. Thank you for attending Nova Group's annual vendor performance review. Benjamin slowly took his seat but couldn't hide the irritation in his voice. Before we start, I'd like to understand how someone who worked for my company 48 hours ago is suddenly leading this meeting. Nolan folded his hands on the table. My employment history isn't part of today's agenda. A few people around the table exchanged subtle glances, impressed by how quickly he redirected the conversation. Benjamin leaned back in his chair. Let's stop pretending. We both know this review is personal. Nolan calmly opened the performance file. Then let's make it professional. He projected the first report onto the large screen. Delivery accuracy had fallen from 98% to 89% over the previous 18 months. The next slide showed repeated quality control failures. Then came customer complaints, missed compliance deadlines, and rising warranty costs. Every chart was supported by independent audits and internal records collected long before Nolan ever joined Nova Group. Benjamin interrupted several times, trying to explain each issue as a temporary setback caused by changing market conditions. The analysts listened respectfully, then presented documentation showing identical concerns raised by multiple departments over more than a year. One explanation after another quietly collapsed beneath verified evidence. Nearly an hour into the meeting, Benjamin finally pushed the folder aside. Let's be honest, he said, looking directly at Nolan. None of this would have happened if you were still my employee. The room became completely silent. Everyone waited to see how Nolan would respond. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply looked Benjamin in the eyes and said, You're right. Benjamin blinked in surprise. Excuse me? If I were still your employee, Nolan continued calmly, I'd be sitting on the other side of this table defending Weston Flow. But I'm not. Today, I'm responsible for protecting Nova Group, and that responsibility is greater than any personal history either of us shares. Even the senior legal counsel slowly nodded in approval. Benjamin realized something in that moment that unsettled him more than any report or financial chart ever could. The young man he thought he had broken yesterday was no longer asking for acceptance. He was making decisions that could determine the future of Benjamin's company, and the hardest decision was still waiting inside the final folder that Nolan had not yet opened. Nolan slowly opened the final folder and slid a copy toward Benjamin before placing another set in front of every committee member. Unlike the previous reports, this one wasn't a summary. It was a recommendation. Benjamin glanced at the first page and immediately understood why Nolan had waited until the end. The document proposed suspending all new purchase orders with Weston Flow until every compliance issue had been corrected and independently verified. It wasn't a permanent termination, but it would immediately freeze millions of dollars in future business. Benjamin looked up sharply. "You're overreacting." Nolan remained composed. "This recommendation was drafted 3 weeks ago." Benjamin frowned. 3 weeks? The procurement director nodded. Long before Mr. Edwards joined Nova Group, Benjamin quickly turned through the remaining pages, searching for some sign that the decision had been driven by personal revenge. Instead, every conclusion referenced audit reports, engineering reviews, customer complaints, and contractual performance clauses. The recommendation had existed before the confrontation at Weston Flow ever happened. Nolan quietly folded his hands. "Yesterday you believed this meeting was about my family. Today you've seen that it's about your company's performance." Benjamin's jaw tightened. "You expect me to believe that's just a coincidence?" "No," Nolan answered calmly. "I expect you to read the evidence." The room remained silent as Benjamin continued reviewing the documents. For the first time since arriving, he stopped arguing and actually started reading. The deeper he went, the more obvious it became that every weakness had been documented by Nova Group's internal teams over many months. There wasn't a single accusation he could honestly dismiss. Finally, he closed the folder with a heavy sigh. "What happens if this recommendation is approved?" The chief compliance officer answered before Nolan could speak. "Weston Flow will remain an approved supplier, but no additional contracts will be awarded until every deficiency has been corrected. Existing obligations will continue under enhanced monitoring." Benjamin understood exactly what that meant. His company wouldn't collapse overnight, but competitors would immediately begin replacing future business. Years of reputation could disappear within months. He slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, looking older than he had only an hour earlier. Then he did something nobody in the room expected. He turned toward Nolan and quietly said, "I made a mistake." Nolan didn't respond. Benjamin continued speaking, this time without arrogance. "I judged you because I believed success belonged only to families like mine. I never imagined." His voice trailed off as he glanced around the conference room. "I never imagined who your father really was." Nolan finally broke the silence. "You still don't understand." Benjamin looked at him in confusion. "This has nothing to do with who my father is." Nolan gently pushed the performance report back across the table. "If Nova Group belonged to someone else, and these numbers were exactly the same, this meeting would still end the same way." Benjamin lowered his head. For the first time in decades, he realized he wasn't losing because another family had more power. He was losing because he had ignored the standards he demanded from everyone else. But Nolan wasn't finished yet. There was one final decision that would determine whether Weston Flow still had a future with Nova Group at all. Nolan allowed the silence to linger for several seconds before sliding one final document across the table. Unlike the previous reports, it wasn't a suspension notice. It was a corrective action agreement. Benjamin looked down at the title, then back at Nolan with visible confusion. "What's this?" Nolan answered calmly. "Your opportunity to keep earning our business." Several executives exchanged quiet glances. They had expected a harsher recommendation after everything that had happened. Nolan continued, "Nova Group doesn't exist to destroy companies. We exist to work with companies willing to meet our standards." Benjamin slowly opened the agreement. Every requirement was measurable. Independent quality audits, quarterly compliance reviews, delivery benchmarks, employee training, customer satisfaction targets. Nothing in the document mentioned their personal conflict. Everything focused on performance. "If Weston Flow satisfies every condition within 6 months," Nolan explained, "your company will remain eligible for future contracts." Benjamin looked genuinely surprised. "You're giving us another chance?" Nolan held his gaze. I'm giving your employees a chance. They shouldn't lose their livelihoods because their CEO made poor decisions. Those words struck Benjamin harder than any accusation could have. For the first time since entering the building, he realized Nolan wasn't trying to defeat him. He was trying to protect hundreds of families who depended on Weston Flow for their income. Benjamin slowly lowered his eyes. I don't deserve this. Nolan didn't disagree. Maybe not. The room fell completely silent. But the people working on your factory floor deserve the opportunity to succeed if they're willing to improve. Benjamin's shoulders sagged as the weight of those words settled over him. Yesterday he had judged an entire family because of pride. Today the man he had humiliated was separating one executive's mistakes from the lives of hundreds of innocent workers. That difference defined true leadership. Benjamin carefully signed the corrective action agreement before pushing it back across the table. His signature looked slower and less confident than it probably had in years. Nolan signed beside him, then closed the folder. The review was officially complete. As everyone began gathering their documents, Benjamin remained seated. Mr. Edwards, he said quietly. Nolan looked up. May I ask you one question? Go ahead. Benjamin hesitated for a moment. If I hadn't insulted your family yesterday, would anything in this meeting have changed? Nolan answered without the slightest pause. Not one word. Benjamin slowly nodded, almost to himself. Then I spent my entire career believing power meant controlling people. He looked around the conference room before continuing. Today I learned real power is being fair even when you have every reason not to be. Nolan stood and extended his hand for the first time that morning. After a brief hesitation, Benjamin accepted it. There was no victory celebration, no public humiliation, and no triumphant speech. Only a quiet handshake between two men who now understood that character always outlasts status. As Benjamin turned to leave, his phone suddenly rang. He glanced at the screen, and the color drained from his face. The caller wasn't from Weston Flow. It was his daughter, Amelia, and the first words she spoke would change everything he believed he had managed to save. Benjamin answered the call the moment he stepped into the hallway. The confidence he had managed to preserve during the meeting disappeared within seconds. Slow down, he said anxiously. What happened? Amelia's voice was shaking so badly he had to pull the phone away from his ear for a moment. Dad. I made a mistake. Benjamin closed his eyes. Tell me. She took a deep breath before continuing. After everything yesterday, I kept thinking about what you said, that Nolan's family would never belong with ours. But after seeing what happened this morning, I started asking myself why I had listened instead of thinking for myself. Benjamin remained silent. I went back to our house today, she continued. Eli kept asking when his dad was coming home. Her voice cracked. He doesn't care about money. He doesn't understand family names. He just wants his father. Benjamin slowly leaned against the wall outside the conference room. For the first time in years, nobody was asking him for advice or approval. Instead, his own daughter was forcing him to confront the consequences of the values he had taught her. Amelia, he whispered. I don't know if I can fix this anymore. She answered almost immediately. Maybe you can't, but I still can. The call ended, leaving Benjamin standing alone in complete silence. Inside the conference room, I watched through the glass wall as he remained motionless for nearly a full minute. Nolan noticed him too, but didn't say anything. Finally, Benjamin knocked softly on the open door. His posture had changed completely. Gone was the executive who had entered the building, expecting everyone else to justify themselves. The man standing there now looked exhausted. Mr. Edwards, he said quietly. May I have one more minute? Nolan nodded. Benjamin stepped inside and looked directly at me for the first time that day. Mr. Edwards, I owe you an apology. I didn't interrupt him. Yesterday I believed wealth gave me the right to decide which families deserved respect. His eyes briefly moved toward Nolan before returning to me. I spent my entire life building a successful company, yet somehow I failed to build the kind of character I saw in your son this morning. The room remained silent. Benjamin took one slow breath before continuing. If my daughter chooses to repair her marriage, I won't stand in her way again. Nolan finally spoke. That's her decision, not yours, not mine. Benjamin nodded. You're right. Then he looked at me once more. You raised a better man than I ever understood. I stood, walked across the room, and stopped a few feet in front of him. No, I replied calmly. He became that man because life tested him long before you ever did. Benjamin lowered his head, without another word. As he quietly walked toward the elevator, I realized the most important victory of the day had never been the contract. It was the moment one proud man finally understood that respect can never be inherited, purchased, or demanded. It can only be earned. What none of us knew was that before the sun set that evening, Nolan would receive one final visitor whose decision would determine whether his family still had a future together. Late that afternoon, Nolan received a message asking if he would meet someone outside the old house one last time. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me. "Do you think I should go?" I smiled. "Only if you're going because you've found peace, not because you're hoping someone else will give it to you." An hour later, we pulled into the quiet neighborhood where he had once believed his future would unfold. Amelia was already waiting on the front porch. She wasn't wearing the expensive jewelry her father had always insisted reflected the Wilson family image. She wore simple jeans, no makeup, and she looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. Eli saw her first. "Mom!" He jumped out of the truck and ran into her arms without hesitation. Children rarely care who wins an argument. They only care who comes home. Amelia held him tightly before looking toward Nolan with tears already filling her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Not because everything fell apart, but because I let someone else decide what mattered more than my own family." Nolan remained quiet for several seconds. "Do you still want the divorce?" She slowly shook her head. "I wanted security. I thought money meant security." She looked at Eli playing with a small toy truck on the sidewalk. "Now I know I already had the only security that really mattered." Nolan didn't rush to embrace her. He had learned too much over the past few days to mistake emotion for change. "Trust doesn't come back because someone apologizes," he said gently. "It comes back because they choose differently every day afterward." Amelia nodded. "Then let me earn it." There were no dramatic speeches after that, no instant reconciliation. They simply agreed to begin again, one honest step at a time, for Eli's sake and for their own. As we drove home that evening, Nolan quietly asked me something he had never asked before. "Dad, why did you hide Nova Group from me all those years?" I looked through the windshield before answering. "Because I never wanted you to wonder whether people respected you or your last name." He smiled thoughtfully. "Benjamin spent his whole life believing a family name created great people." I nodded. "When the truth is exactly the opposite." Several weeks later, Weston Flow successfully completed the first stage of its improvement plan. Benjamin kept every commitment he had signed, never once asking for special treatment. Amelia withdrew the divorce petition, and although rebuilding their marriage took time, it was finally being built on honesty instead of pride. As for Nova Group, business continued exactly as it always had, guided by the same principle that had shaped every decision since the first rented warehouse 32 years earlier. Character before status. Responsibility before privilege. Legacy before wealth. Looking back now, people sometimes ask what the greatest investment of my life has been. They expect me to mention factories, contracts, or company growth. They're always surprised by my answer. The greatest investment I ever made wasn't in a business. It was in raising a son who could remain fair when revenge would have been easier, because companies can be inherited, fortunes can disappear, and reputations can change overnight. But the values a parent passes to their child become the only legacy that truly survives every generation.